بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thank you everybody for joining and everybody on Facebook Live. Today we have some amazing information, inshallah, and we have two very special guests with us. We have Mujtaba Ahmed with us, and we have Dallas Wright with us. Mujtaba Ahmed has more than 6 years of experience in mental health, substance abuse, and inpatient, outpatient facilities. He currently works as a psychotherapist for a private practice called Grow Therapy. He earned his master's in social service administration from the University of Chicago, including the Alcohol and Other Drugs Abuse Advanced Training Program. He is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified alcohol and drug counselor. So that is Mujtaba Ahmed. Next we have with us Dallas Wright. Dallas Wright is a lifelong Chicagoan with years of experience in the city's nonprofit sector while working at Inner City Muslim Action Network, also known as Iman. He helps support the mental health needs of the Southside families. He earned an MA from DePaul University in clinical mental health counseling. He currently serves as a wellness professional and board member at Ta'leef Collective. As a researcher at Northwestern University, Dallas evaluates citywide violence reduction initiatives and their impact on communities experiencing high levels of gun crime. So one of the main reasons why this seminar, this discussion is taking place is a majority of issues that the masjid see in the community, a majority of issues that I saw, and whether it be through escalation or just through personal contacts and conversation, there's three things that we hear all the time that have lots of overlap. First is anxiety. Second is depression, and I know these are very broad. And third, which has become a pandemic on its own, an epidemic on its own, which are school shootings and workplace shootings, right? So when we get together today, we want to pick these two gentlemen who are specialists, their brains, to see what we can learn from you gentlemen today, inshallah. And we really thank you guys for making the trek here. One of you guys, mashallah, is coming from Rockford. One of you guys are coming from the city, mashallah. So we really, really appreciate your time and all of the work that you put in to helping people get better, inshallah. So let's start off with Mujtaba, if you don't mind. The concept of mental health and behavioral health. Just so we can start off very basic, so this can be a learning experience for all of us. Mental health and behavioral health, we hear those used interchangeably, right? Are they both the same thing? Are they different? You know, are they synonymous? You know, if you can help us out with that, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for the introduction, Amir, and I'm happy to be here. So these two terms are definitely used interchangeably. Behavioral health is a broad term that can include mental health, and the easiest way to make a distinction is mental health has to do with someone's individual state of mind, how you're feeling, your sleep, things of that nature. And behavioral health has to do with your cognitive habits and how the choices you make can affect your mental health, your biology, and your environment. So, for example, there's two well-known problems out there that we're seeing in society: drug addiction, eating disorders is another one, self-harm is another one. These are behavioral health problems. They're choices that people are making that can impact their mental health, their state of mind. These choices, obviously, it makes it seem like there is some sort of responsibility put on that person to make themselves better. That's not what I'm implying. I mean, people who suffer from addiction And for example, cutting, there are obviously underlying contributing factors that can contribute to the appearance of those problems.
Sorry, what do you mean by cutting?
Cutting, like self-harm.
Cutting themselves.
Yeah, cutting themselves. So it's actually becoming quite a big of a problem. It's more common with females. So female teenagers we're seeing a lot of self-harm and self-injury with that. The reason why most patients do that is to feel something. They're so numb, emotionally numb, that cutting themselves and experiencing that pain, even though it's pain, it's better to feel that than nothing. Than nothing at all, because you're completely numb. You're devoid of any emotion. You're just like an emotional zombie, so to speak.
So does that pain end up becoming some type of pleasure for them? Is that why, or is it?
Not necessarily pleasure, but, well, you could, yeah, like a release. I mean, one might describe it as pleasure, but relief is a good way to describe it. Yeah.
Thank you, man.
Yeah. So the behavioral health is has to do with the cognitive habits and choices that an individual makes, and the mental health has to do more so with one's state of mind, in relation to other things, of course. But if you had to describe it in one sentence in terms of its main distinction, that would be it.
Okay. Dallas, I'd like to ask you, unless you want to add on to that, Bismillah, go ahead. I had something else. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. What Mujtaba said was really important, I think, is that there is a subtle nuance, and I like to visualize. That helps me understand concepts. And one thing that helps me as well is like the difference between behavioral and mental health in some ways, or how they kind of are related. Imagine like an iceberg, right, sitting in the water. The tip of that iceberg, you can kind of say you're seeing the behaviors, so you're seeing someone's habits and actions and behaviors and compulsions and things like this. And then underneath typically is a lot more ice of that iceberg. That is kind of like mental health, right? Where you don't necessarily see the complexity and the depth of some of their thought processes and the way that their state of mind, literally, until maybe you notice that point and the tip of the iceberg kind of rears its head through behaviors.
Wow. That's a great visual. Jazakallah khairan. One question I have for you is, I hear this statement all the time. This is for you, Dallas. I hear this statement that thoughts about or not being sure about the future is anxiety, and feelings of the past have to do with depression, right? So as far as anxiety is concerned, just summarize however you like, just so we can get the ball rolling on bigger issues. What should everybody know about anxiety? What is anxiety, and what are some symptoms of having anxiety? Because just because you're anxious about an exam doesn't mean you have like any type of anxiety disorder. It just means like you're a human being, you're facing some type of anxiety. So what is anxiety, and what is it as like a disorder?
Yeah. It's anxiety is like one of those things that I think the general because we kind of our culture has become more and more familiar with mental health, and these sort of terms like anxiety and depression make the rounds. People tend to have kind of a general understanding like that, right? It's being nervous about the future, or being nervous about things that are that unknown, or expecting things that may or may not happen. It can be a little. It's not necessarily as temporal as that, right? Because based on things that have happened in your past, that can contribute to your anxiety about the future, because that same scenario might be coming up. Great example, school, right? Studying for a test. Crap, I failed the last test and I got one coming in the same subject. I'm nervous. Or marriage. I'm going to meet this sister's family for the first time. I'm very nervous. But these are healthy sorts of anxiety in a way, because they're going to push you to prepare and to take the necessary steps to succeed and make it through that situation. Right, so anxiety is something it happens to everyone, and it can be beneficial. I think the way that it tends to be used is really like an anxiety disorder can come into play when that tension or that nervousness it's disproportionate to the situation that you're anticipating or that you're encountering, right? So,
Like when you say disproportionate, you mean like a disproportionate fear of what's to come?
yeah, so like there's a common type of anxiety like social anxiety, where people will, going to school or maybe like a social gathering, a barbecue or something, people may feel ill or feel sick, get headaches, right? Begin sweating, engage in like sort of compulsive behaviors that help them redirect their focus away from that anxiety. Other things that are generally harmful, right? It depends on the person in a lot of ways and other kind of physiological factors. But that's kind of the thing. There's kind of like a general healthy anxiety or kind of a typical normal quote unquote anxiety, and then there's a level where it can kind of reach where it becomes counterproductive or harmful because you're not really coping with that nervousness in a way that's helpful.
So the person can actually be very productive, very intelligent, but because of these extreme feelings of anxiety, they're not able to obviously
Yeah,
get out of that
in
shell,
extreme
I guess.
cases, it can lead to like panic attacks, hyperventilating, and things like this.
I see. For Mujtaba, we hear depression used figuratively, and we sometimes hear it by clinicians, and whether through YouTube videos or whatever the case is, social media. What is depression? And some people may know that they're depressed, and some people may not know that they're depressed. So what is depression? What are some signs that people should be looking for, just in case? Again, we don't want everyone to be on like high alert and like find any little thing like, oh no, I think I'm depressed. No, like, I mean, like, what's the best way of?
So I would say with any mental health disorder, if it's causing problems in your life, like major impairment in any aspect of your life, whether that's at work, at home, with your wife, brothers and sisters, within your friends group, if it's causing impairment or problems in any aspects of your life, then it's a problem. You know, just kind of use your instincts and I don't want to say common sense, but use your instincts when it comes to a lot of those issues. And a lot of times, other people around you will start to notice there's a problem before you do, right? Especially during the pandemic, people start to isolate. They don't, and a telltale sign is you don't find the same enjoyment in things that you used to find enjoyment in. And so according to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's what mental health professionals use to determine if you have a mental health disorder. There's a spectrum. There's mild, there's moderate, and there's severe, right? And so a lot of people could fall under the mild category and be not having significant problems in their lives, but that's a situation where you probably want to seek help. Because it can end up getting worse if you don't pay attention to it, right? And so not enjoying things as much as you used to, not sleeping well, overeating or not eating enough, not wanting to see your friends anymore. And there's a list of symptoms. I think you have to experience 5 of those symptoms over a 2-week period in order to get a diagnosis. But, you know, and it has to do with your mood too. If your mood is low or if your mood is up and down, a lot of people have what's called bipolar depression. And that one form of it includes mania, where you have very high highs, where you engage in risky behaviors like spending too much money, gambling, drug use, or really low lows where you just sleep all day long.
That's really interesting. Sorry to cut
And
you
so
off. Yeah.
that's much easier to diagnose, but for people who are confused about whether they have an issue, you definitely, and what I definitely want to say in regards to that is just seek help, talk to somebody, because there's help out there, whether it's at the local masjid, whether it's your primary care doctor is a great place to start. With such a huge focus on mental health now and the stigma of it slowly kind of decreasing, I think it's not as big. it's not as big of a deal to ask for help, even for men, right? Because for men, it's harder to talk about our feelings than it is for women.
Seems like we have to have a separate segment just for that.
Yeah, no. So
With you guys next month. Yes.
so my point is just, if there's less shame and stigma surrounding it than there has been historically.
Yeah.
So just ask for help, because there's been a lot of unfortunate events that have happened, people completing suicide, people engaging in drug use, all sorts of other problems, right? So
Yeah.
you want to catch it while it's early.
Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah.
before we even get into the
Yeah.
next issue, I mean, everybody's kind of aware of this. In the masjid, generally how it works is the masjid is a beautiful community place. We eat together, we pray together, obviously, and we have community parties and dawats and all that stuff together. So naturally, people like to come. People who congregate at the masjid like to come to this place where they feel comfort to talk to the imam of the masjid, the resident scholar, about some type of social and emotional issues that they're going through. They may be going through some marital issues. They may be going through some, what seems to be like anxiety type issues, all types, whether it's physical, emotional abuse. So what masjids generally do is, as imams or as resident scholars, we're kind of like the first line of defense, kind of like in a community, kind of like how they have in churches. If it is not religious, spiritual related, right, which is referred to as faith-based counseling, like how can I counsel somebody that's having issues and wrestling with the idea of like atheism or agnosticism and stuff like that, right? But if it's something more than that, usually we escalate it to people like Mujtaba and like Dallas, and we basically have people on a Rolodex, and we say, hey, listen, we're escalating this issue to you. This is what this individual, and obviously in confidence, and it's confidential, they discussed with me, they're okay with me discussing this with you. So, and then we just basically hand them off, right? So the good thing about religious institutions are, they're kind of like the first line of defense, because people trust the area of where they can come and talk to people about their problems and their issues on a spiritual level, right? So that's just something that I know that everybody knows that, but it's just something that we should also be cognizant of. And Mujtaba mentioned, you just have to ask somebody for help, right? And a great place to ask. I'm not just saying just ICW, any masjid. If you're at a masjid and you know that the imam is present, you can rest assured that the imam definitely has connections to some type of initiative or counselors or therapists that you can talk to him in confidence, and anybody and any religious group within the masjid, they can definitely direct you to people like Mujtaba in Dallas. So for Dallas, one of the things that very much intrigued me about yourself is not only your work with Iman, but also as a researcher for Northwestern University, but you basically evaluate citywide violence reduction initiatives and their impact on communities experiencing high levels of gun crime, right? And I'll tell you why I think this is very important for all of us. When the Uvalde shooting happened, the next day, I think it was, well, I can't remember if that was a Thursday or whatever, if it was during the weekday, but I remember the next day, usually taking my son to the bus stop, it's a cool way of just me talking to him before he goes to school. Because sometimes when he comes back from school, I'm still working, so it's like, hey, I have this 5 minutes with him to chill with him and talk with him, see what's going on in school and all that kind of stuff, But the next day, when I had to drop him off, it just felt really weird, right? And I was just like, now I get it, because before my kids were in private schools, and we had armed security guards and doors locked and certain protocols, but you kind of get it now when you send your children to a public school. You kind of get the worry, even though it was so far away. But it's just something that crosses your mind. You're like, I always thought that's what the people thought. They didn't think that it was going to happen to them, right? So as we get closer to this topic of school shootings, and is there any link of these individuals that mass shoot schools, is there any link of anxiety and depression with these individuals that make this egregious choice to kill innocent people, right? Children, in this case, in the Uvalde case, right? What is generally happening with these individuals?
Yeah. So it's a great question. It's a deep question because there's a lot. Like, kind of Mujtaba touched on it. There's so many environmental factors that kind of interplay with someone's mental health, but I won't necessarily make like a causal connection, but there definitely is a trend where you have individuals, especially younger men, who have a history of mental health issues, right, who end up engaging in these horrendous acts. Which I mentioned bipolar depression and bipolar disorders. Those are very common. Folks tend to be medicated sometimes, and you'll see, oh well, they went off their meds, quote unquote. There's certain trauma-related issues as well that some individuals might be going through, even older ones, right? Some folks may have been in the military, for example, and experienced or witnessed certain things. Some folks may have had childhood trauma, and that, while it's not necessarily a cause for them engaging in those actions, there's a trend there, and there's a pattern that we can kind of clearly see. And it makes sense, right? Someone who is not necessarily thinking clearly, thinking straight, who's overwhelmed by something and not able to cope with those challenges in the way that we think quote unquote normal person would cope with them. Extreme situations lead to extreme behavior, right? And those environmental factors, right? Easy access to firearms, an opportunity to go and find somewhere where there may not be armed security or protection, right? All these kind of ingredients swirl into this really disastrous pot. And so the challenge, I think, thinking about mental health and then those types of issues are trying not to pathologize people who may share the same issues, I guess, right? Because we see, like you were saying, in your immediate surroundings, there was nothing indicating that you were at risk of anything like that. But we see it on TV. When it does happen, it's a big deal, and so everyone's talking about it, and so we have to confront it and deal with it. But at the same time, I think for me, the challenge becomes, okay, well, someone else who may be dealing with bipolar disorder or PTSD or drug addiction, different types of aggression disorders, how can we deal with those folks and kind of bring them in, embrace them, and try to help them with the resources they need without treating them as like potential mass shooters, I guess, you know?
Yeah, and the reason why this, just my own thinking, so I'm just going to think out loudly. A lot of times when I hear, and I just kind of observe, and the analysts that talk about this kind of stuff on the news, it's kind of like a catch, because you have people who actually went to jail. I can't remember the name of the mass shooter, but when he went to jail, he actually attained his goal of getting the attention that he wanted with the mass shooting. And it's really difficult because you have to cover it on the news, but at the same time, it's feeding that person. And then you have this concept, which is of like copycatting. People, they see it happening, and they may be attention deprived. And this is just my observation. I may be completely wrong. But they may be attention deprived, and they see that this is a way of putting themselves on the map. But my question is, this may be another deep question, but what's allowing them to pass that point to take somebody else's life in mass? It's not like just going and like pulling a prank on somebody. It's not like paintballing and like just, spraying somebody with a paint. It's literally taking lives. But in the Uvalde thing, it was really, I think it really hit home to a majority of Americans because it was children, right? Third graders. And so how does what's being surpassed inside of them to the hardwiring as a human being to bring themselves to not just kill like people, which is horrible in itself, right? As Allah mentions in the Quran, killing one innocent person is worse than killing all of mankind, right? but killing innocent children, like, what happens? What is being blocked off? What's being barriered in this person's heart, in their soul, in their mind to follow through with this? That's the part that really troubles me. Like, how does somebody bring themselves to do that?
That's a really difficult question because I think when you think about mental health being a contributing factor, it certainly is, but this is exclusively an American phenomenon in the last 20 to 30 years for the most part, right? And so mental health issues exist everywhere in the world, and some people would argue in countries where there's more poverty, the stress of living in impoverished environments can cause mental health issues on its own, and we live in such a country with such excess, in resources, and yet it's still a problem. So I don't know why it's an exclusively American problem, and I don't want to get into a political discussion about it. Some people would argue it's the gun culture and whatnot. So to answer your question though, without evaluating that person, and doing some sort of mental health assessment, it's hard to determine what caused that person to engage in such a heinous act, right? And so there are probably a lot of different factors. The person probably had some kind of trauma as a child. A lot of them were bullied as kids, right? And you're left feeling not understood by anyone, socially alienated and isolated. And then you add in trauma, maybe they're unmedicated and they should have been medicated. But again, without formally diagnosing that person, and it's hard to know, right? And that might be part of the problem. A lot of these people, quote unquote, slip through the cracks and never had access to mental health services. And if they had, it probably would have made a difference. It maybe could have made a difference. But there's a clear understanding that it's a premeditated act, right? And the intention was there. So to say that this person was acting in self-defense or wasn't in their right state of mind, I don't think should be part of the discussion, right? Because they knew exactly what they were doing. So I mean, that's what I'll say about that. But I don't know as far as like what's going on in that person's mind during that moment. But you might be able to.
Yeah, no, I think it something you said, it made me go back to like that iceberg example, right? So we see the shooting happen, and it's just like, oh wow, like this came out of nowhere. Like no one was expecting this. How did this happen? People who knew the person was like, I never would have thought But I mean, Allah knows best. But it's hard for me to believe that someone would just go from like zero to that point, right? There are things that happen leading up to that.
There had to be a process.
And there's a progression of the kind of mental disorder, the sickness of the heart, right? There's a progression there where there probably were several junctures at which there could have been an intervention of some kind before we get to like kind of this end point. And so I think that's another key thing that I think we miss sometimes with the discourse is just that things like this don't happen overnight. There's, even though you can't predict it per se, there have to be some red flags in that particular young man's background that could have been. I think they were talking about some internet kind of posts that he was making, things like this. So there are things that kind of flash up that you can see. And so I think it's, to Mujtaba's point, there's got to be folks around, again, to bring back like the community issue. And like a lot of times, at least when I was doing community work, folks had rough family situations, right? Families tend to be the first line of communication and support. And so if you don't have that, then it becomes very difficult to find that elsewhere. And so, or for folks that kind of notice things, say, hey, are you okay? Or like, let's talk about this, So that was just another thing that kind of came up.
So since you still have the mic right now, actually, if you can hand me that mic, I want to see if I can do something while they're talking. Okay, battery. So what are some of the initiatives, since you have the mic? I'm really actually interested in this. And then I want to get to Mujtaba after that because I have a very specific question for him. What initiatives were very fruitful, or did you find as far as limiting violence in your work?
Yeah. So,
Sorry.
no, so the type of, I guess when they say like gun violence initiatives, this is a kind of or like community violence interventions. These are newer terms for older and existing things, like gang outreach or street outreach. Um, there was a film that came out like 10, 15 years ago called The Interrupters. I don't know if anyone ever heard of it or saw it. But
Interrupters?
The Interrupters, right? It's that same, similar type of model where you have folks who used to be involved in the streets, even perpetuating violence sometimes, being the victims of violence, returning back to try to mitigate conflicts that they have a particular, they call it LTO, license to operate, or they have a social capital to be able to use and say, hey, let's try to calm this down or stop this. That is not necessarily a sustainable way of preventing violence, right? Because there are, in addition to personal decisions, environmental factors, and just long-standing conflicts between people that span 5, 10, 15 years that folks are kind of stepping into that you don't necessarily control. And so there's a lot there, but what I've seen that's worked recently, there are organizations who really almost kind of not replace families, but serve as like a secondary or like an auxiliary family structure for individuals where they can kind of come into a regular place 4 or 5 times a week. They feel supported, they have access to mental health professionals, job training, they know what they can eat. If they have children, their children can get kind of supplies or even have childcare sometimes, right? There's kind of like a wraparound sort of model to support an individual because they didn't get that outside of that space, right, growing up. If you think about like the average kid, the American kid, right, they go to swimming camp or summer camp, Boy Scouts. In high school, they go to college visits and they do all these things, right? Those are dollars and resources being invested into an individual from 6 to 18. Maybe, I'm guessing, $150,000 a head, right?
Possibly, yeah.
There are some individuals who I work around and work with who maybe got a tenth of that invested in them, you know? And so it's like, at a certain point, there's gonna be a difference in outcomes there. Again, personal responsibility and decisions also play into that, but you can't divorce those from the environment that people are in. And so I think the organizations that have done well in Chicago recently are those who recognize that disparity and try to give basically guys like a first chance, not a second chance, but they try to say, okay, we're gonna invest in you. Hopefully, because you can experience a different type of lifestyle, you'll make different decisions, right? And they use CBI and these other types of models to be able to help them start to think differently. The challenge, again, just becomes, it's not your family, it's not your house, it's not your block, right? So you might spend 20 hours a week here in this space, but the other 100-some hours of the week, you're back on the block, you're back at your house. You know, your families might be dysfunctional, or you still gotta carry a gun, right? Or the people you were beefing with a year ago, they didn't change, right? So they might still be looking for you. So there's a lot of...
And their situation could have gotten a lot worse,
exactly,
too, while you were gone.
Exactly. They could have lost people,
Yeah.
you know? So there's a lot of factors that are outside of community violence interventions purview, you know?
And the reason I was asking you that is because, alhamdulillah, we just finished Ramadan. We asked Allah to accept everything we did in Ramadan. And I was telling this to my kids too, man, like even a week or 2 weeks, even a month after Ramadan, man, like I really miss Ramadan because you have that environment. And in the midst of Ramadan, you really think that you can be at this pace for a long time after Ramadan. And then Ramadan finishes and you just don't even have it in you to do even a fourth of what you were doing in Ramadan, right? And that's just 1 month, right? Imagine, just on both sides of the spectrum, imagine somebody who lived in a situation where everything was working against them and they're able to escape for a little bit to be a part of some initiative, but they still have to come back home, right? So that loop can be very, very difficult to come out of, and it's very unfortunate that, you know, us as human beings have to go through that, man. You know, may Allah protect us. But Mujtaba, I know that one of your specialities is in addiction, right? My question has always been, is there any correlation between any type of addiction, all the types of addiction that are out there, and violence, like, is there a correlation there, or are they two completely different things? Do addictive behaviors not become violent, or am I not making sense to you?
I don't have an extensive knowledge about the correlations between the two, but what I can say is that most acts of violence that are committed in America, they happen when someone's under the influence of something. Whether that be alcohol, it's the number one drug, and alcohol is a drug, by the way. So the number one substance that contributes to violence is alcohol. Most people who commit acts of violence are under the influence of alcohol in addition to other substances, usually.
So my research obviously is not extensive on mass shootings and stuff like that, or even workplace shootings. But people who commit these crimes, are they actually under the influence of something when they do it too? Or is there any, do you guys like have some type of record of that, of knowing that? Or is there some way of knowing that?
We're talking about two different groups of people in society and two different sets of issues, right? Like the mass shooters, not to get into race and demographics and the resources people grow up with, but typically the mass shooters we see are middle class to upper middle class Caucasian kids who grew up with every advantage that one would want for their children. And then you have the other 97% of violence that happens in the United States, which is unfortunately has to do with structural barriers that Dallas touched upon, right? There's a long history there, and as a social worker, we're most committed to the vulnerable populations out there. And so it's a really difficult issue to tackle because there's like you said, there's a long history there. People are ultimately a product of their environment. You have a history of redlining and all these other problems.
Sorry, what's redlining?
You'd probably be able to explain it better than I could, but it's basically formalized residential segregation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. If you look at like Hyde Park, for example, there's just a bunch of one-way roads surrounding it, so people have a harder time getting in there.
I see.
So what was your question again? Sorry, I got off on a tangent.
No, that's fine. So people, is there a correlation or some type of relation between addiction and violence?
Yeah, and so that's all I had on that. I don't know, other than that people are usually under the influence when they commit acts of violence. There's certain drugs like methamphetamines, alcohol, cocaine sometimes that can make you more likely to engage in violence. But that's all I could say about that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
In Dallas, through your research, I know that you're a researcher for Northwestern University. If you can just kind of give us like a little bit of a synopsis of what you do as research there. I want to get a little bit into education, but we're going to bring it back to question and answer, inshallah, for the crowd. But what type of research do you do there at Northwestern?
Yeah, so I guess we kind of got into a little bit, but there are several kind of citywide organizations and then like collaborators between multiple organizations that are committed to trying to mitigate the street level conflicts that result in gun crimes, right? North side, west side, south side, east, all across the city, there are communities dealing with it, and so there are organizations that pop up naturally. People are going to respond to those types of challenges and try to mobilize and fix it. And so what we do at my lab is we offer kind of broad research support. So if they have questions or if they are trying to collect their own data, right, we can offer some sort of advisory kind of support in that way, or even like actual staff capacity at times. And then we also, because of the politicized nature of this issue and just the fact of how resources flow throughout the community, we also do evaluations of like their impact and how many people they're reaching and what sort of, are we seeing reductions at even like the kind of like street level or even the neighborhood level in gun crimes in the area, because those organizations tend to be poorly resourced. And so they're kind of year to year, 3 years to 3 years, relying on grant money, private donations, the occasional city or county investment, right? And so if you don't have, unfortunately, someone like a Northwestern University stamping your program or showing that we made an impact, it's hard to get those dollars, and it's hard to keep your doors open. So knowing that, right, we're committed scientifically to that process, but we also kind of understand that we're in a position to be able to advocate. And the city's done a great job, I think, of committing dollars and committing resources to that. The state has an office of firearm violence prevention now. It's actually headed by a Muslim brother. The city is, I think, by 10 times increased its investment in this. So there's progress being made. But again, like I said, this violence is a symptom of things. It's not really like the core of the issue, right? There's a cycle there. It destabilizes communities. It creates widespread kind of tension and anxiety. People are terrified to kind of be out in public in their communities. But at the same time, if you compared the police budget to the budget that kind of outreach or kind of community-based interventions receive, it's maybe 1 or 2% of a police budget, you know? And so there's a long way to go, I think, in that field, but that's pretty much kind of what we try to do at my lab.
Okay. And I'm going to relate this to our original point of anxiety, depression, and the shootings. Mujtaba, I know that one of the specialities you have on your website, or the website of where you work, is you specialize in CBT, right? Or your study in cognitive behavioral therapy. And this always intrigued me. Can you just kind of inform us generally what cognitive behavioral therapy is? And I have a follow-up question after that. So, yeah.
The easiest way to explain it is if you can challenge the way you think about things, you can feel differently about things. And if you can feel differently about things, then you'll engage in more favorable or better behaviors.
Yes. So,
right? So if you can change the way you think about and reframe the way you think about things, or challenge negative beliefs about situations, then you can feel better about that situation, regardless of what that situation is, right? And then you'll behave better. And so there's a set of tools that we use as clinicians to get people to that place where they're able to behave differently.
very nice. So is cognitive behavioral therapy ever used as a primary therapy, or is it kind of supplemental, used with other type of therapies? I'm not talking about any specific issue with, anxiety or depression, or people who have violent behavior issues, but is it used primarily as a therapy, or is it used along with other therapies?
It's used primarily as a therapy on its own most of the time. If you ask 100 clinicians what they're most familiar with, most of them are going to be familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy. There's another form of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, which was created for people who had borderline personality disorder. And so people with borderline personality disorder tend to engage in a lot of self-destructive behaviors, like the ones we talked about earlier: cutting, really a lot of problems in their relationships. They struggle with boundaries, being assertive, manipulative behaviors. So DBT is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's a set of principles that have to do with distress tolerance, interpersonal effectiveness, mindfulness, and emotional regulation. And the whole idea behind those principles is that if you can, when you're in a moment of where I don't know what to do here, I'm going to engage in these recurring problematic behaviors, like being manipulative with someone, or you feel like cutting yourself, right? Like people who cut, for example. There's a set of tools and coping skills essentially that we use to distract yourself long enough so you don't engage in that behavior. And one of those might be calling somebody, right? Like you have a list of people you can call. Another one is like a common one people use is like, imagine you're, you know, a rock and in the water, and you're a visual person, so you might appreciate this. So like imagine you're a rock in the water and there's two holes, one on each end, and you're that rock. And this one just cut out. Hello? Oh, never mind. And then, so the water is kind of like your emotions, right? And so if the water flows through the rock, that's ideal, right? Because you want your emotions to kind of flow through you, and you want to notice how it feels in your body. You want to be able to describe it, because a lot of times what happens, people suppress their emotions, right? They let their emotions come in and they suppress them, right? And when you hold in your emotions and you suppress them, it causes a lot of problems, and you start to engage in negative thinking and behaviors that can cause problems in your life. Or you don't address them at all, right? Like you know, the first situation is you allow them to come in, right? The other situation is where you don't allow it to come in at all. You're just like, no, anything negative, nope, don't want to deal with it, right? And so the goal is to be able to let your emotions and your thoughts that are problematic kind of flow through you in that moment, right? Because if you can do that, you're more likely to have insight into why you're feeling the way you're feeling and what you can do about it. And so cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on a lot of that, like cognitive distortions, like thinking that's irrational, right? Like a lot of people have irrational fears, and so CBT is used a lot with anxiety. Actually, there's a form of CBT that's specifically created for anxiety. And so it's a lot of work, right? So people who have these disorders need to do a lot of work on themselves, and that's not limited to medications, right? That's like going to therapy, getting out of your comfort zone, and being able to try new things that are going to be uncomfortable, right? Because change is often uncomfortable.
It is, yes.
But if you can get to that point, then, and you have a little bit of hope, that's all you need is a little bit of hope. And I think.
Yeah. If you want to add on to it, go ahead, because I have a question for you too, if you don't mind, Dallas. But I don't know if you're reaching over to grab the mic or. Yeah.
That last point that Mujtaba made is really important. Is like the time frame that we're dealing with, right? These are issues that are not compatible with like an instant gratification worldview, right? The depression, anxiety, the symptoms that are related to those things take time, and they can kind of rise whenever the Prophet said something, right? Whenever he felt unsettled or distressed, he would pray. The hadith is not, one time he felt distressed and he prayed. It was whenever, right? These are things that happen to anyone at any point, depending on your circumstances, right? And so I think that was a really crucial key point that you made, is like these are life challenges and they're natural things that people encounter. It's not stigmatizing necessarily in any way.
Yeah. So before I get to that point, I think it's beautiful, both of you guys' examples, but one thing that I had taken from what they just said, maybe you guys absorbed this also, is we heard this word so much as children, sometimes from our parents, sometimes from our teachers, sometimes from our peers. And I'm giving you guys a preface to this word because it sounds corny to some people, and just this phrase that mindset is everything, right? And sometimes just grasping what's happening to you, depending on what you're going through, it's a very difficult thing sometimes to grasp what's happening to your own mind sometimes, right? But Dallas, you mentioned that Rasulullah that he used to pray, right, when something happened. And Mujtaba, you mentioned something that almost kind of made me laugh, is that you said sometimes making a phone call to distract you. And that used to remind me of, like, sometimes, like, I'd be home alone, like, late at night, not late at night, maybe like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, I don't know, I was probably like 10 or 11 years old, and it was only for like an hour or whatever, and I'd hear a noise. And I just like turn on the TV or something, or I call one of my cousins who's in the crowd right now, and just, not tell them that I was worried about something, but you just distract yourself. So we kind of do that almost naturally sometimes, right? It's like you said, like a coping mechanism. And if we take what Mujtaba you mentioned, and you kind of alluded to this, Dallas, is that how is it possible that the most well-fed country in the most available resources that that we have in the United States, that we're not as happy as impoverished countries, right? Alhamdulillah, I've got a chance to travel to many countries, and I didn't really see depression or anxiety and self-harm at such an alarming level that I would see in the United States. So one thing that obviously makes me think is, look, and please hear me out when I say this, and then I'll move to you guys, inshallah, because I don't want to take your time. But look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts everybody in a situation, and all of us in certain situations, and that is up to Allah. Sometimes you're able to see the wisdom of the hardship that you went through, right? I was just talking to some of the brothers the other day of, sometimes you have to go through something very, very difficult and you become something amazing, right? Like if you just look at like boxers and like UFC fighters and like that are like top of their game, they all have the same story. They used to be bullied when they were younger. So it's this weird catch that occurs that you go through a certain type of trial and tribulation. I'm just talking about on a worldly level. And they become like the world's most amazing combat fighters, right? Same thing with a lot of bodybuilders, same thing with lots of athletes, Olympians. Like I was reading this report of, it was a little bit of satire in it, but it was saying that, in order to be Olympian, you actually have to be crazy. You actually have to be driven crazy to be an Olympian, because there's no way you can achieve that without being crazy and constantly losing sleep and constantly having anxiety about your performance and whatever track and field, whatever that you're doing, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts us in many situations. Some of those situations are very, very difficult for us, which is why we have to have a community to help us, right? Islam is a very communal thing, right? We have to have and it's very difficult to work on things on your own, because you think that every year, like, I'm hitting, I'm not hitting, I'm past my 40s now, but what ends up happening is you learn every year. You think like, man, what I did when I was just 2 years ago, that was so ridiculous. But then it's like 2 years later, like, man, I just matured this much in 2 years. But that's constantly happening to us, right? And we're constantly going through trials and tribulations. And I'll just mention one verse and then I'll come to you, Dallas, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, a beautiful verse, because Allah covers all of the major trials and tribulations, and everything generally branches from these main trials and tribulations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give you a portion of a test. He doesn't say we're going to test you completely. A portion of. So everything that we're being tested from beginning of humanity to the end is just a portion of what could have happened, right? وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ. We'll test you with fear, right? How many things, just as clinicians, are connected to fear, right? خَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ, and hunger, right? How many things are connected to hunger? وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ, and taking away of your monetary resources and sources. وَالْأَنفُسِ, and people will be taken away from you, right? Close people or people that you may have never met. وَالثَّمَرَاتِ, and those things that you may grow, meaning out of the ground, and like agriculture and all that. But Allah says something very beautiful. He says, almost a disconnect to let you know that there's lots of hope in one thing. He says, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. It's almost like saying, like in English, I've just mentioned all these trials and tribulations. Just give glad tidings to those who are patient. It's almost as if, but Allah tells us how to have patience. Allah doesn't tell us just be patient and that's it. Like, okay, like how do I become patient? وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ, those people who are afflicted with any type of calamity, قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ, that we belong to Allah and we're going to return to Allah. Now, for me, that changes something very much because that makes me understand that I don't really own myself. I'm actually not my property. So that actually alleviates me from something, but it adds something as far as a responsibility, right? Like I'm entrusted with this vessel, and I have to return to the maker of this vessel, right? وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. They say, إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. We usually hear that when somebody passes away, right? We say that part of the verse, but you can say that for anything. If you actually lose something, you could say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi. So Allah is basically tying all these trials and tribulations to us returning back to Allah, our original maker, right? But it doesn't end over there. Then Allah gives us a beautiful incentive. أُولَٰئِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ صَلَوَاتٌ مِّن رَبِّهِمْ وَرَحْمَةٌ. And upon them are blessings min rabbihim, from their creator, wa rahma, and there's mercy, right? And I don't want to get too much into this, but someone can ask in a trial and tribulation, yes, I get Allah is going to send blessings upon me. That's amazing. But where's the mercy in all of this? Because you have dealt with, just you two probably have dealt officially and unofficially with hundreds of people just between you two. And I'm pretty sure in the back of your mind, and I'm just speaking for myself from escalating to people like you, that I can't tell some people that, man, this is a blessing in disguise, because that can be horrible for them. But in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm like, subhanAllah, but this person is actually probably being saved from this, just the way my mind is computing at the time. Because maybe I went through something similarly like that. And the beautiful thing about going through a trial and tribulation is that you're able to comfort and have lots of empathy for that person. And you can be like, dude, I got this. You got this. I'm going to be with you. I went through this. And there's obviously lots of other benefits. So the mercy part is really, really important, I think, that, may Allah cure all of our hearts if any of us are feeling any type of anxiety or any type of depression. But I think that there's one thing that Allah is referring to as rahmah, is that there's rahmah in this thing, but you're not going to be able to see it immediately. Just like our du'as. You make du'a to Allah, and you're not going to be able to see it right away. You make du'a for something, and something else gets granted for you. You have to keep your eyes open to realize that Allah is fulfilling your du'a, but not what you asked for, because sometimes what you ask for is not best for you. And the promise that Allah makes of guarantee of the du'a, that He's going to grant it, but give you what's actually best for you, right? So, thank you for bearing with me, ladies and gentlemen. Just to give it perspective, because how closely related to what you gentlemen are saying is to Islam. Now, people are now going to be naturally, parents, probably more so than their own children, are going to be feeling some type of anxiety as, school returns in the next few months, right? People go back to school. What are some things that parents can do with their children just to help alleviate that anxiety that their children may be having, or the parents just may be having? What can they do? Is it something collective that they should be doing? Is it something that they should be doing with the community? Should they sign up for some courses? Like, what would your general plan of action, nothing specific, general plan of action just to move in that direction be?
So a couple things I think that, because I have children as well that come to mind. They're not school aged yet, but
Enjoy it.
nieces and nephews.
That was a joke, guys, I promise. Yes.
Nieces and nephews, though, are in school.
Yes.
And I think there's a couple things. I think parents, sometimes the school can feel like maybe a distant place. I don't know necessarily about out here, but I know CPS it's a massive system.
Yeah.
You don't even always go to school in your neighborhood, and so the school can kind of feel disconnected from the parents, and vice versa. And so I think if parents can maybe feel a bit more empowered or motivated by this to be more active in the school in terms of like making sure that security is up to the standards that they want, for example, or at least going to the school and asking, hey, like, what are you all's protocols in these types of situations, or what mental health resources do you have for students? Parents becoming, I think, a little bit more active in the school space is very important, because ultimately, it's still their children. They're at the school 8 hours a day, but again, because of your children are there 8 hours a day, you should be involved in that place.
I see.
If anywhere.
Some great advice.
So I would say that for the parents. I think also I mean, you quoted the ayat. I think it's also taking the means spiritually as well. You know, teaching the children to make wudu before you leave the house, reciting ayatul kursi, trying to remember and reflect on Allah's names and attributes, right? And carrying those things with them so that they don't necessarily feel some of that, what they call clinically free-floating anxiety, where it's just like, I just feel unsettled and nervous, and I don't necessarily have an object for that. Like, I just feel it.
That's interesting. I never heard of that phrase. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So those were just two things that kind of came up.
Yes. Mujtaba, what about you? Anything that comes to mind?
A lot of the problems that we've been discussing today, in my view, and you probably would agree, is because there's been a breakdown of community, partly, I think, due to the advent of suburbia. A lot of, like just the physical design of a suburb, right? Like 80% of people in America live in a suburb, but you have to drive everywhere you go. You don't see your neighbors around the way. Like, whereas in some areas, like small towns and inner cities, I personally think there's more of a community feel. He might say, which he would be true to say, Dallas, is that, yeah, there's a lot of problems in the inner city as well. There are. But I think in the last 50 years, there's just been a breakdown of family, community, and religion, too. I feel like we ultimately live in a godless society, right? And as Muslims, we're up against that, and it's a huge challenge. And so I just wanted to add that in since this is a safe space to discuss Islam and these point of views, I think being able to integrate your spiritual life into the discussion with a lot of these issues that we're talking about is really important, and I think what you said reminded me of that point. And about summer, I mean, summer is just a tough time for kids, I think, in general, and parents, to keep them busy. What do I keep them busy doing? The structure is not there necessarily, right? And so I think filling up their time as much as possible with productive activities is super important. Whatever they're interested in, whatever their hobbies are, and just talking to your kids too, right? Because a lot of times parents just stick them in so many different activities, just get good grades, and that's it. And my kid's getting good grades, he's in a lot of activities, must mean he's doing well. Well, when's the last time you talked to him, right? Or her? Ask him how he's doing. And summer's a good time to do that, right? Because they'll be around the house more. So I think that's really important, something that was missed in my generation growing up, right? Because when I was growing up, it was just like, do this, do that, get good grades, and that's very typical, right? But I think we're more informed now as a society, so there's things that we can do, there's resources out there for help. And so just talk to your children, check in with them,
No, I agree with you 100%. I think one thing is, that heart-to-heart conversation, like after that shooting thing happened, I just sat down with my son, and I said, how are you feeling after all this, right? And you see how mature they actually are, talking about how they feel. And I think that's a really good opener. It's really easy. And we get it, like, alhamdulillah, parents want what's best for their children. They're very busy working day and night. And obviously we appreciate our parents forever because of that, because we were their number one priority. They forgot about all of their hunger. They forgot about everything just to make sure that we were happy, You guys probably heard this before too, like mothers, they always say, if you eat, my stomach's gonna be full, So it's one of those things. So caught in that complete phase of their life, obviously it's very taxing, and it's understood, But I'm going to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen, I feel like we can go on for about 3 hours, and we have about 15 minutes left, inshallah, till adhan. And this is one of many, inshallah. I know these two brothers, they're very busy, and they're too cool to come here every month, so they're probably not going to be here. I got to find some other people. Um, but, but let's have some questions, inshallah. If any of the ladies or gentlemen, any question, inshallah, there's a no judge zone. Any type of question that you feel, yes, bismillah. Wa alaikum.
Thank you both for presenting and sharing all that information. Brother Mujtaba, to your last point about like suburbia and our kind of instinct to insulate our communities, our families from like kind of any sort of distress, right? I've been thinking about that as someone who kind of grew up in Chicago suburbia. Um, and we see that like, okay, our parents kind of, in our best interests, helped keep us away from a lot of material difficulties in the suburbs. We were able to get good educations and go to good schools, get good careers. But we see that material insulation doesn't protect us from distress and like from dealing with distress in healthy ways. Um, and like having talked to friends and peers, I can say that everyone feels like a level of like kind of isolation, alienation with their communities, their families. Like no one has, like I would say the majority of people I talk to do not have like a wholehearted feeling of like, yes, I am loved, yes, I have a place to belong. So I guess my question for all of you is, what are some of like the priorities or values that a community has that can help kids and young adults cope with feelings of disconnect, isolation, alienation, all of that? I don't know if one said.
Sound like Sajid. So I know the brother.
You guys know
mashallah.
each other.
Yeah,
There you
yeah.
go.
I haven't seen him in a while, mashallah. It's good to see you. So it's a really good question. I think one thing that sticks out for me, having spent time in the suburbs, not necessarily growing up there, but having family there, just living relatively close to those areas. I don't know if I can sum it up in like one word, but basically like feeling a sense of like autonomy or like agency maybe is the word. Like, okay, there doesn't always have to be a service for everything or institution for everything, right? Especially in places where folks have resources. Like, I think a way to build community is like through doing things and through acting and building things. Like our elders who established a lot of the masajid around the city, right? And communities that we hear about that were buzzing at those times because they were building something, you know? There was a mission, a sense of shared purpose. So I think those are things that I've seen really work, or I've heard about at least really working in the past.
Yeah, I mean, those are good points. I think, in order to really connect with your child, whether it's an 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 14-year-old, 16-year-old, find out what their passions are, right, and what their interests are, and try to connect with them on that level, and go do things in the community where you're able to celebrate those passions and interests in a meaningful way. And I know that sounds cliche, but like when I was growing up, I really loved baseball, and it would have been cool during the summertime to, get together a group of other Muslim kids or even non-Muslim kids and form a league of some kind, right?
That sense of belonging.
Yeah, that sense of belonging, and and if the parents can help out in some way to do that, that's great too. It's a way to build a meaningful relationship and connection with people in your community and with your own parents too, and I'm a strong believer that, 80% of a person's success and well-being in life starts in the home, right? So it's talking about all the resources we have living in America. It's like, that's all great, but you can't buy good mental health, right?
If the home is broken, then
Yeah.
what's outside doesn't matter, right?
There's certain things you can't buy: peace and love and respect within the household. There's certain things you can't buy, right? They have to be earned, and the work has to be put in.
Yeah.
So instead of trying to figure out what activities, what camps, where are they going to go, I've been just trying to focus on the actual relationship. My son's only 5, but when he gets to the age where he's asking tougher questions or going through certain phases of his life, if I have that relationship with him, he's going to talk to me before doing something maybe he shouldn't do, right?
So,
So that's it.
so just like on a religious level, I'm nowhere really as cool as these guys, but just like on a religious level, Brother Sajid, I think you asked a great question. I think on a community level is we have to understand like the mindset of what it means to be an ummah, right? So one question I like to ask people during like a seerah class, but one question I'll just ask all of you ladies and gentlemen, inshallah. If I was to ask you a question, who is the greatest sahabi, what would you say? Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. Who would say anything else? Umar? Anybody else? Shaykhna hadratikum? There's a scholar by the name of Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, who's an Egyptian scholar. You guys have probably heard of the book Tafsir al-Jalalain, right? It's called Tafsir al-Jalalain because it's written by the two Jalals. Jalaluddin al-Mahalli, who originally wrote the book. Jalaluddin as-Suyuti completed the book after Jalaluddin al-Mahalli passed away with the same style, which is why it's an amazing book, very concise. Enough about the book. He says Jalaluddin al-Suyuti was one of the most well-renowned scholars in Islamic history. He wrote on every single subject, specialized in every single subject except for mathematics. He said, the greatest sahabi is Isa alayhi salam. The greatest sahabi is Isa alayhi salam because Isa alayhi salam is living, and on Yawm al-Qiyamah he's going to come down and he's going to be from the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. After Isa alayhi salam is Abu Bakr because the prophets are first and foremost. What does this have to do with our mindset? We have to understand that this ummah that we're a part of, this community, is belonging, even though we may not feel it physically in front of us, there's a prophet that's also in this ummah. Musa alayhi salam, when Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam ascended to the heavens, and Isra al-Mi'raj, Musa alayhi salam wished that he was from the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Like all of us right now, the prophet, Musa alayhi salam, the one who threw the staff, the one who challenged Fir'aun, he wished that he was in your shoes, right? This is the community that we belong to. Ibrahim alayhi salam, over 2,600 years ago, when he makes a dua, standing in Mecca, and he says, "Oh Allah, send a messenger from amongst these people." We are the response to that dua. The dua that Ibrahim alayhi salam made, we are the answer to that dua. That's the reason why we're here talking about Islam. Like, look at the name, Islamic Center of Wheaton. Why Islamic? Because of the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam. That's what we belong to, and that's a legacy of our tradition, right? So the beautiful thing about Islam is it makes you not just realize what's in front of you, because how often are we in situations that are not very good and they can be toxic, but we always have a rich history to refer to, not just the prophets, but Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the hadith, and we have the Quran. That's the miracle that's with us, right? So that gives us a beautiful sense of belonging. So if the world in front of you is literally in shambles and nothing is working for you, then always know that you have Allah, right? Sisters, does any sister have a question before we conclude? Because I think Adhan's in 10 minutes, Sheikh? 32, okay. So about 7 minutes, inshallah. And I wanted to give you guys at least a 5-minute or whatever break for wudu and just stretch. We've been sitting for almost an hour and a half. Any questions from the sisters? Just let me check. Nothing from the sisters? Brother, go ahead. Go ahead. So did you say privacy? Can you repeat the first part of your question? I didn't hear that part. Did you hear it? Oh, you heard it? Okay, sorry, go ahead. If you guys can repeat the question, kind of, just summarize it and then answer it.
So his question was, he had a friend who was going through depression and wanted to seek mental health services, but was worried about privacy, that the HR department or someone at the company would find out that he's going through depression. And so I can assure you that it's confidential, and even the HR department is not going to know why, or not going to know that you're seeking help to begin with, right? And why that maybe you're out of the office, right? And so there's a thing called HIPAA, and you're probably familiar with it. So there's legal protections to ensure that people's privacy is protected. So if he's still struggling, please let him know that.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
You had your hand up too, right, brother?
Yes, so I'm not sure. Have you seen a gentleman named Andrew Tate blow up on social media?
Yeah.
So basically, he's touching on depression and stuff. I want to get your thoughts on depression. He was saying that when any time depression is to improve your life, it's you have to lag behind your goals and purposes. So obviously, we all have universal purposes.
So, you guys, everybody heard his question, right? Go ahead, Bismillah.
Okay. Somewhat of an agreement. I think the way that he expressed or described depression, the way that I think we talk about it typically or generally as a society, it's kind of like a either or. Either you have depression or you don't. You're depressed or you're not. And it doesn't always really work like that. So like for depression to like take root, like he said, yeah, when you get to a point where you feel like there's nothing that can be done and you're really kind of in like this deep, dark hole, then you may not, it understandably is difficult to kind of remember or develop a sense of purpose because that's depression by definition is overwhelming. Again, like at the same time, we have stories about our Prophet ﷺ and Sahaba who they dealt with these types of feelings despite, right, having very clear purpose and goals and mission. It's just, the goals, purpose, and mission are those tools that you mobilize when something comes into play that makes you start to feel that sense of kind of despair, depression. You can fight that off.
Alhamdulillah. And I'm so sorry, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I think we kind of have a hard stop right now because Salah or the Adhan is going to be called in about 2 to 3 minutes. So we really, really appreciate everybody coming. I know Friday night is usually a busy night. This is just one of many of these events, inshallah. Every time we have this, it's going to be a slightly different lineup or maybe a completely different lineup, just different types of professions, just touching upon different portions of behavioral health and mental health, inshallah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect our hearts from ham wal huzn, from sorrow and depression. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those of us who are feeling or seeking or feeling or being basically encompassed with any type of harm or self-harm, or know somebody who's going through self-harm, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to mediate and to help us as individuals in our community. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, most importantly, to protect our iman and the iman of our children. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to raise us with the nabiyyin, with siddiqeen, with shuhada. جزاكم الله خيرا وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.